of course, this comes up in the political realm as well, with all the Facebook 2016 election stuff. So there's clearly, we're not the customers here because we're not paying for it, and we're not really even the product. I think what the product is so-called behavioral futures, so prediction about what we're going to do. And those get sold to advertisers, and it's quite valuable information because if you know exactly what I'm interested in or have a pretty good idea and where I'm going to go, then you can give a much more targeted advertising than just putting something in the Seattle Times. So think about like futures markets in wheat, where you say I'm going to predict that wheat will be so many dollars a bushel. So this is a behavioral future. So we're predicting what people will do, and then based on that, selling ads. And Google has an auction model for ads, for example, as does Facebook. Shoshana Zuboff, who's an emerita professor from the Harvard Business School, coined this term surveillance capitalism, and that's what I'm going to do too. She has a really interesting book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, as well as some earlier articles. And she talks quite a bit in great length about what the problem is and where this originated and the history of it, but not so much solutions. So that's more what I'm going to do in this talk. Zuboff uses the term surveillance capitalism in her book for these business models like Google and Facebook and Twitter and so forth, in which the services like Google Search or Facebook social media are provided free to the end user at this cost. And I'm going to broaden it, Marvin and Volker and I are broadening it to include fee-for-service models that still use personal manipulation and personal surveillance and perhaps manipulation. So Uber, certainly for the drivers, is in that category. And I sometimes wonder about the consumer side. There's this interesting study the Uber research lab did where they found that people were willing to pay much more for a ride if their cell phone battery was about to die, which makes sense, because that's your last chance to get a ride, and because the Uber app has access to your phone, it knows the state of the battery. Now, as far as I know, they didn't deploy this, but this would be a pretty interesting example of behavior manipulation. Or Spotify, which is a music streaming service, sells data about what you're listening to, and they market it as, we know what your emotions are at the moment because what kind of music you're listening to. So that's also important fodder for advertising. This also indicates, this is not just a Silicon Valley thing. Spotify is Swedish. So there are some big problems with surveillance capitalism, and actually, I'm going to talk about this. What I want to do is show 10 minutes of an interview with Zuboff, and then I'll go back to my thing. I'll give you a pointer to the interview at the end of the talk. And also, please throw in questions along the way or comments if you'd like. So let's have a look at this, and let's see if we can.
Is titled The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Its author, Shoshana Zuboff. She writes, quote, at its core, surveillance capitalism is parasitic and self-referential. It revives Karl Marx's old image of capitalism as a vampire that feeds on labor, but with an unexpected turn. Instead of labor, surveillance capitalism feeds on every aspect of every human's experience. Shoshana Zuboff is Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School. She joins us now for the rest of the hour. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's start at the beginning. Define surveillance capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism departs in many ways from the history of market capitalism, but in a fundamental way, it is continuous with that history. We know that capitalism has evolved by taking things that live outside of the market, bringing them into the market dynamic, transforming them into commodities that can be sold and purchased. So famously, industrial capitalism claims nature for the market. It is reborn as real estate, as land that can be sold and purchased. It claims work for the market, reborn as labor that can be sold and purchased. So surveillance capitalism continues this tradition, but with that dark twist. In our time, surveillance capitalism claims private human experience for the market dynamic as a free source of raw material that is translated into behavioral data. These data are then combined with advanced computational abilities to create predictions of what we will do, predictions of our behavior, predictions of what we will do now, soon, and later. And these predictions are then sold to business customers in a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures. This was first invented in the context of online targeted advertising at Google back in 2000, 2001 in the teeth of financial emergency during the dot-com bust. But this same economic logic has now traveled not only from Google to Facebook and throughout the tech sector, but now throughout the normal economy into virtually every economic sector.
So, comment on these last few headlines just of the last week. I mean, for example, the report in Britain that calls Facebook digital gangsters.
Well, since just about a year ago now, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the Cambridge Analytica revelations. One of the consequences of those revelations is not only that a lot of us all around the world have been put on alert that all is not well in the digital realm. That's one thing. But a second thing is that, at least in the UK, the government has taken this very, very seriously. And there's been a parliamentary committee investigating Facebook. This committee was able to get leaked documents, secret documents from Facebook that had not been reviewed by the public. And just last week, they issued their 108-page report. It's very powerful, very damning, and among other things, they refer to Facebook as behaving like digital gangsters because they have understood that Facebook has been essentially stealing, in other words, as I've described, illegitimately taking our private human experience for its production processes that create these prediction products, which is what they sell and how they make money. The key thing that I want our viewers to know is that surveillance capitalism doesn't stop at Facebook. And right now, it's a hugely positive development that we are looking at Facebook with this kind of scrutiny and perhaps moving to finally regulate this corporation. But that is the beginning, not the end of our challenge. Surveillance capitalism is an economic logic that includes but moves far beyond Facebook at this point in time. And so we are going to need the social response that addresses, interrupts, and outlaws this new economic logic, not just a single company or not just a couple of companies.
You write, a global architecture of behavior modification threatens human nature in the 21st century. Explain.
All right, well, once you understand that surveillance capitalism is an economic logic, it is not the same as technology. This is one of the big lies that has been perpetrated, that these methodologies are the only way that digital technology can work, that there's an inevitablist propaganda that has been fed to us. So we need to pull these issues apart. We have digital technology, which we believed would be emancipatory, empowering, democratizing, and it still can be. In the last 20 years, it has been overtaken, hijacked by an economic logic whose economic imperatives put it on a collision course with democracy, both from below and from above. One of the things that surveillance capitalists learned is that the most powerful predictions of human behavior come from actually intervening in our behavior, touching our behavior, to nudge, to influence, to tune, to herd our behavior toward its commercial outcomes. And what this has done is made them take hold of the digital milieu, all of the devices, beginning with our phones and our laptops, but the sensors, the facial recognition, the smart dishwasher, the smart television set, the smart car, the smart city, all of this digital infrastructure now has been taken by surveillance capitalism as a way to nudge and tune and herd our behavior toward its guaranteed outcomes. It does this with subliminal cues. It's a highly scientific process. It does this in ways that it brags about are always outside of our awareness, so that we have no right of combat, we cannot resist, we cannot say no, and we cannot exit. So this is what I call a global means of behavioral modification, where essentially this great digital architecture that we've built in order to be an emancipatory and life-giving process for us and help us in our lives has now become commandeered by surveillance capitalism as a means to modify our behavior toward its commercial ends, which is a direct assault on human autonomy, a direct assault on our decision rights, a direct assault on the whole notion of individual sovereignty. Back in the 1970s, there was a Senate committee that included people like Edward Kennedy and Sam Ervin. These folks met for many months, and they decided that behavioral modification was a pernicious action, that it was a complete defiance of democratic principles. And they decided that no federal money would fund any kind of program based on behavioral modification in prisons, in schools, in hospitals. Today, the year 2019, we've just spent the last 2 decades where, as democracy slept, the private sector, under the aegis of surveillance capitalism, has been able to command the digital to create a literally ubiquitous means of behavioral modification without anybody saying no, and without most of us even noticing or understanding what has occurred.
You talk about herding, so let's go to herds.
Okay, so I'm going to put the URL for this on the last slide here, in case you want to see the rest of it. And there's a second part to the talk as well. Let's see. So let's get back to. Okay. So anyway, Zuboff mentioned quite a.
You might, yeah, it won't go. I don't think it'll go away by itself. Yeah.
Will it go away by itself?
I don't think so. That's there it goes.
Oh, okay. Technology.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so there's big problems with this business model. There's the invasion of our personal privacy, obviously. There's the fact that smartphones in particular are quite addictive. People spend, young people in particular spend huge amounts of time on Facebook, and this is not sort of an incidental effect. It comes from the economic logic. The more time you spend with the applications, the more data there is to be gathered about you, the more ads that you can give to somebody. So it's not an accident. There's this kind of surveillance. It's really undermining human dignity, and there's certainly big problems for democracy. So as there's the whole Russian interference in the election and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Maybe another aspect of it is because of the logic of wanting to spend more time, there's a push toward sort of more and more radical content. So if you use YouTube and you're looking at something, you get a recommendation for something a little edgier and a little edgier and a little further in the other, whichever direction you're looking at, because that draws you in. That meets the economic logic of it. And then my colleague Lance Bennett in political science here has been working with colleagues in Germany, and there are just many, many thousands of fake Facebook accounts for the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. And Facebook, lets this happen, but it's in their economic interest. There's the kind of, the environmental side of things where, ads are useful to sell stuff and you have more stuff, but then the earth can't really handle it. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So that there are certainly lots of benefits from the kinds of services that these companies, Google, Facebook, Uber, et cetera, provide. Used by billions of people, the fact that they're free mean a lot more people can use it. Although we could talk about other funding models. And they've, intertwined with our daily lives to this point of, certainly business and commerce, but scholarship, but, so that it's pretty rare for me to go to the library to find journal articles or anything like that anymore. You just always find them online. I still like books, but that's a different matter. Social engagement, political activity, and so forth. So, any alternative that we come up with, we should be trying to save the good parts. Okay, so this paper that I'm building on, we're trying to look at, well, what can we do about all this? It's really a daunting problem. So here's some preliminary steps. These are underlying the solutions: education, regulation, and resistance. And I'll talk about all of these in a second. And they're all mutually supported. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So first of all, education. It's important for people to understand how these services are being funded. Google is not providing Gmail and search because they are feeling benevolent. Similarly, Facebook is not providing, the rhetoric might be that, but that's not why they're doing it. It's because they are gathering this data to power the behavioral futures market and sell advertising. It's important to know what kinds of information is being gathered about us, and behavioral manipulation, for example, the push towards sort of more and more extreme content, and what the consequences of all this. Another part is connecting the dots regarding the latest scandal. So, you see, well, Facebook has done X outrageous thing, or Google was monitoring, open Wi-Fi networks, or whatever it might be. And I think it's important to understand this is all driven by the economic logic. It's not, if they just didn't do X, everything would be fine. There's a rhetoric from the companies which is focused on individual choice. By building up this profile of you, we can give you much more useful, targeted advertising that are things that you're interested in. And it's sort of empowerment, personalization. But, and it's true that the advertising is more targeted, but there's this very dark side to the whole thing. Another thing that, you can sort of get used to some level of surveillance, and I want to push back on that, saying, no, this is not okay. So, regulation. This is, of course, a controversial topic, particularly in the US. And I think actually the Europeans, the EU, is more likely to be ahead on this one. So there's this general data protection regulation that is a pretty significant step forward in the EU, and I think the details of that are going to be worked out. It has a lot more informed consent of, what is being gathered about me, and do I agree with this? So I think regulations ought to be able to provide these kinds of things. I ought to be able to know what's being gathered about me, where is it stored, who else knows about it, how long is it going to be kept. So informed consent is this notion that came out of medical research, where I want to try some drug, and you get informed consent, meaning I agree to this experiment and I have the full information about what's going on. It came out of various medical scandals, and you can apply the same thing here to the. I want to meaningfully understand what's being gathered about me. So there's kind of a lot of smokescreen around this, unfortunately. So the privacy policies and the like. Zuboff says they're better called piracy policies, because they just go page and page and page and page, and so who reads these things? I don't, and it's sort of partly is the lawyers want to cover every base, but partly it's just you get exhausted, you just can't. It's not a meaningful informed consent. Yeah.
Well, the other thing about that informed consent is that you only have one choice. If you take the time to read those 40 pages of information, basically it's accept it or don't use the app.
That is true too.
So,
That's an important point, yeah. Or as an example, like the Nest thermostat gathers all this information, and you can say I don't want it, but then the consequence is, well, we can't guarantee, we can't push any security updates, and we don't guarantee it will work at all anymore.
Or you can't use Microsoft or Apple or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I think regulation also ought to just simply outlaw some kinds of information gathering. It's not a matter of consent, it just ought to be forbidden. Personally, I would outlaw anything about children being gathered. It's kind of a radical step, but I have grandchildren, and they like to play these games on my phone, but it's pretty clear that they are gathering information as you play.
Does GDPR does anything like that for the children?
I don't know. I know there's a let's see. She's actually a peeress of the empire in England who has been pretty firmly pushing against the kind of monitoring that's going on with children. And I don't know what the status is in GDPR though, but there's certainly stuff that more to do. Yeah, please.
Sorry, in the U.S., stuff like FERPA has been neutered in the last decade, and so actually schools themselves, educational institutions are sending massive information about students without any ability to opt out. That's a real problem.
That is true too. I guess there's also even, I don't know if it's still going on, but in the 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of issues with schools would have custom versions of Gmail, but it would still be scanning messages.
And even if you do outlaw, who's going to guarantee that they're actually obeying the laws? How are you going to monitor that? With the proprietary software,
Right.
you don't have the slightest idea what's going on.
So that's a very hard one. I guess my recommendation is they need to allow for independent expert audits of their software, and the fact that they say it's proprietary is bad. Either you do that or you're turned off. I'm a professor. I get to say things like that.
Well, in the case of China, they want to do this even more.
Yes.
To totally control your life.
Yes.
So that's going to be a really big problem.
Yeah. So we can let's save that thought for the discussion period. But there's there's the social credit scoring system in China. So that takes all this technology, but it's been used then. For example, you get points for things, and you get points deducted if you are caught jaywalking or by association with other people. And then, if your score is bad, you can't, for example, reserve first-class train tickets and things like that.
Get a job.
Yeah, so it's you can sort of see, where things are going.
And if you're a certain race, you can't do things. The Uyghurs, for instance, I understand, everything is really monitored.
Yeah.
You can't get a Coke because you're fat.
What?
You can't get a Coke because you're fat.
Okay.
Well, I believe they would do at some point.
Yeah.
Well, actually, they can't. The thing is, they make money off of the Coke,
Yeah.
and they make money if you get sick, because then you have to see doctors, get pills and all that stuff. It's
They
good
make
for the
money
economy.
anyway.
So, and sort of just to finish this slide, I think another possible purpose of regulations is to allow other business models to develop, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. All this is going to be super hard, but it seems worth trying to resist this rather than just saying, well, they're too big, they're too powerful, we give up. Okay, so what about resistance? There's the limitations of this, but one is, well, we just don't do some things, like the delete Facebook movement, which is certainly possible, although, I do a certain amount of political activity, and unfortunately a lot of the announcements and everything in the discussion ends up on Facebook, so either I use my Facebook account, or I don't participate in that. That's a
So
problem.
you limit your reach basically if you start Facebook, using Facebook.
Yeah. And Google is much harder to avoid, because there's, the Gmail and the search and Google Maps and, on and on and on and on. There's a woman who tried to avoid using the big 5 tech companies for a week, and it was just extremely difficult. Because there's so many sort of back ends and things that are hooked up into the URLs that they're controlling. So this is hard. It pushes back some, but it's hard. There's interesting art projects around surveillance and resistance that I think can be pretty inspiring. So I'm from the computer science and engineering school, and there's the sort of technical resistance. You can block third-party cookies, which has some effect. Ad blockers are good, in particular for Firefox. You block Origin and other ones, you can do that. Another interesting direction is this tool called Ad Nauseum, which simulates randomly clicking on lots of things. It's like throwing up radar chaff. So the intent is to mess up the data. If you're interested in this, the paper has a lot of URLs of different tools, and there's a couple of things that are striking about it. One is the kind of a cat and mouse game of okay, we'll block third-party cookies, but here's a way around it, and then we can have hardware identifiers on your machine and so forth. So there's that, and then there's just this is actually kind of a lot of work, and for if you're not a techie person, that's kind of overwhelming. So I think these are good things to be doing, but I think it is important to link that back to education of how much work is this, and should I really need to work that hard to protect my privacy, and how is that going to work with people that aren't so technically inclined?
Actually, then once we get with the self-driving cars, which have cameras all around them, and if you're just walking, it's going to follow you wherever you go.
That is true. Well, there's already the Google mapping stuff.
Yeah.
And the Ring doorbell.
Amazon. Oh, that one.
Oh yeah, there's the smart doorbell thing. That's another.
What's it, Amazon Analytics that follows you every time you hit your enter button?
Oh really? Okay. Yikes.
Not quite every day.
Okay, so let's talk about some possible solutions. So a partial solution is for-profit companies that provide some of these services without doing the tracking. So there's a search engine called DuckDuckGo that advertises it does not track you. And as far as I know, they're telling the truth. I mean, it still has ads, and it's based on what you're searching for. So if I'm searching for decongestants, because the hay fever season is up, then it may put ads up, but it doesn't track with everything else I did. And you were sneezing last week too, so maybe we'll do X. Brave is a browser with a bunch of built-in protection mechanisms. So these are all still advertising supported, which I think is why we're able. This is a partial solution. It leaves them vulnerable to the desires of the advertisers. But I'm not, to be honest, totally great about all this stuff of using it. I keep intending to switch from my Gmail account to something else, and the effort of telling all, I don't know how many countless people I got a new email address has been dissuading me so far, but I will do it really. But this one I use, and it works reasonably. Unfortunately, not quite as well as Google though. So,
I switched to Brave today, and it's
How
like
is it?
Chrome. It's Chrome.
Okay.
It's open source Chrome, and it doesn't track, and it claims to be faster, which it appears to maybe be, and it takes all my extensions. So I'll probably stay with Brave.
Cool.
It works better than Tor?
I have not used Tor.
Although
And
Firefox
yeah,
is
because I'm not
It's a
trying.
very different model.
Yeah, it's two entirely different things.
I think Firefox Focus is good also.
Yes.
For
Yeah,
mobile,
Firefox is-
because it blocks a lot of those trackers by default.
It's
Yeah.
easy to clean.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing we can do is, well, change the funding model from surveillance capitalism. So just some alternatives, public funding of things. You know, it's hard to imagine a publicly funded Facebook, but you know, certainly,
National
you know, some basic email or something like that.
National
seems like a
Public
possibility.
Facebook.
You know, other kinds of nonprofit organizations like you know, Firefox, for example. Another possibility is nudging the market by having universities or libraries or employers contract for versions of these services that don't track.
Like that.
And then finally, for specialized domains, there's some other possibilities, and I'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah, I think there's a big problem in that space where Google is used by pretty much all the educational institutions, because they offer for nonprofits and educational, if I believe correctly, free or almost free.
Yeah.
And so, like, my children are using their Google account for Google Docs and Google Mail and for their school stuff. And so I think that's kind of probably the first place where, like, that government or public funding could come in and create like an alternative for this Google Docs kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's very doable as if there's funding available.
Yeah. University of Washington has a contract with Google also, for
Yes.
example. And you know, my email at UW is through Google, but at least the claim is they're not scanning it and monitoring it. As I mentioned, there was this scandal where some years ago they were doing that, even when the public school did, but you know, there was enough of an outcry that they stopped. I don't totally trust them, but
Well, they're gathering enough information from the metadata, your social graph, through your email, from all of the metadata, that they don't necessarily need to see the contents.
no, that's true too.
Whether they clearly have access to it and they can flip it on and off it.
Yep. Yep.
Well, I don't think we can escape from Google because, well, every website must have used one thing that from Google, that's Google Fonts. And I would believe,
You can turn it off.
I block all
well, you need to like
You
take time to
don't need
watch.
to look at it in the font
Yeah.
they specify,
Right.
that's crap. I mean,
Well,
sorry,
And like, so you can block the Google domain, anything from coming.
Yeah,
from
but
these
you need
bad
to
Google
look
domains.
at those ugly fonts.
My problem is YouTube though. It's not YouTube.
Yeah.
that's the hardest.
Can I ask
YouTube
a
is
millennial
hardest.
question? Which parts of the tracking are you really opposed of? Like, do you really care that Google knows that you went to Mexico last week, or that your favorite pub was across the street?
You should.
So I guess personally, I don't feel like, you know, I'm doing anything all that interesting where they're gonna track me, but in principle, I don't think they should be doing any of it. God damn it, it's not their business.
Well, it is their business.
Well done.
My argument or my question
It
here is
shouldn't
they're
be their
providing a
business.
number of services that are available to me, and let's say my daughter goes to college
Yeah.
right now and she utilizes, you know, I'm paying for a Microsoft service for Word, Excel, and everything else annually. And she utilizes Google Docs, which are absolutely free. In turn, they collect some of her information. She cannot afford to pay $100 extra a year at this point to pay for a paid service. So I guess my second question is, who's gonna pay for the paid alternatives? Because majority, you know, people.
Public funding.
He's
I
talking
was
about-
the first one.
That's his,
Public funding, right? If you have infrastructure and it's not hard to do, like what Google Docs has done, is like they have based it on open source software already.
Yeah.
it's Etherpad, it's just.
Right, exactly. So
stale.
there's a bunch of these open source technology that they have leveraged and made it, okay, stable in infrastructure. Why can't public funding do that, right? Now that it's, everybody needs it, right? There was a time when it was not proven that everybody needs it, but now everybody needs it, from children to old people, right? So why not just like lobby for funding and creating such a thing? Because it's like, other services that are provided, like road service. Road is an infrastructure that you collect tax and you build and everybody benefits. This could be the infrastructure for the IT.
My God, that's socialism.
Well, I think there's an important point here is that, you know, there's a lot of useful services and they're free, which is nice, and who wants to pay for stuff when you can get it free? But, you know, back to, there's a huge cost. There's a huge societal cost.
It's
to all
not
this.
free. That's the thing.
Can
So
you
I'm
talk?
not an economist, but it seems to me you could make some sort of argument along the lines of conservation of something, in this case money, in the sense that all these things are driving advertising. Assuming that that is actually a viable business model in the long run, ethical questions aside, that it actually works, then that implies that you're actually spending more money because of that advertising, and therefore, some of this might self-annihilate, right? So you don't, you're asking, well, how can you provide these services for free if you don't, do all these things to recoup that money? But the things they're doing to recoup that cost are costing us money because we're spending more on stuff that they're advertising. So
That's correct.
In some sense, it may balance itself out.
Can you talk about the dangers of what happens to this data beyond advertising? Okay, if they just use it for advertising, what's the big deal? But they have all this data. What else could happen?
Well, there's the behavioral manipulation part.
Collusion.
Yeah, well, I guess, so one part of it is, we don't actually care what you do, we just care that we can predict it accurately, because then our behavioral futures market benefits. But then there's, a political party might find this very useful, because you can target particular kinds of deceptive ads or extreme ones. There was this pretty interesting study by Carol Cadwallader of Guardian in Britain of Facebook in the Brexit campaign, where there was this pretty shadowy set of advertising, very targeted, that would, so somebody in rural Wales somewhere, your town is going to be invaded by people from Turkey because the EU is about to demand that they all be let in. And it would sort of come and go, and it was very hard to keep track of, but it was very carefully targeted. So that's another big downside of this kind of data. It's not just.
But in a sense, in essence, that's just very, very good advertising and could have been done on either side.
Well, that's true.
I think there are bad things that could happen. I was
like
just
what?
trying. Of course, any government could have access to appropriate warrants, whether they have really good cause or not. But what else? That's kind of what I'm looking for. Is what are the bad things that could happen outside of targeted marketing?
I think it used to be we were afraid of our governments. I think the problem is these things are becoming a government of their own. They rule us with their laws and their if they're unregulated by governments, they are this quote unquote one world government of these big corporations that can manipulate and control you and sometimes without telling you, and sometimes if they tell you, you cannot. They say, "Oh, I cannot stay without Google." So Google has become kind of oxygen of that thing that without it you do not think you will exist digitally at least. So I think that's kind of the dilemma, that they have become more powerful than a single government because they are international. They can actually potentially manipulate an international kind of a situation. Think of a war if they want to instigate, right? They can manipulate people here and people there, and then suddenly something happens. They see a version of things that they want you to see. And this is worst case scenario, obviously. It sounds a little science fiction, but they can do that, right? That's the danger. And with the artificial intelligence mixed into the whole mix, once artificial intelligence gets hold of all this data that they are collecting, they can do it pretty darn good and nobody can escape it.
So wouldn't it be easier to just impose a set of laws that basically punishes this information harder?
No,
So
the
instead of
problem
trying
is-
to like, no, don't track us, don't lie to us, don't BS us.
No, the problem is, it's not they. Who's manipulating? It's not Google that's saying, we want to cause this problem, or Facebook. Facebook has built this manipulation engine, they're going to term that they're no longer in charge of it, they no longer have control of it. They can't live without it. It's all about data sucking. And so it's not just they. Facebook didn't say, hey, we want to manipulate the election last time. They were used because they've built this manipulation engine that is not controllable anymore.
That's really a kernel issue.
But let's say they wouldn't track, let's say Facebook wouldn't be tracking a bunch of that stuff, wouldn't you still be able to access, going back to the whole Cambridge Analytica, wouldn't you still be able to access a bunch of people through these ads randomly? It wouldn't be as targeted.
Yeah, the targeting is the problem, right? Not the randomly.
Okay, so it would be less
So,
efficient.
you wanted to say something?
Yes,
Sorry.
but that depends on whether you know this is happening. Who's to tell you that it's happening?
Like, it's hard to detect, especially with artificial intelligence in the mix. It's hard to detect that manipulation also.
Give up Facebook?
Well, then you have to give up Facebook and Google and Twitter and everything else.
More
Harder coming up every.
Yeah, that's true.
And what you're saying, right now, up across the border in Snohomish County, the schools are giving computers to all the kids. Like,
Yeah, Chrome.
That's true, but you also
Yeah,
sign
all
up
the kids
you
have
go
got-
to any website, they've got little Google counters underneath that count how many people visited, and based on that, they get revenue for advertising.
and,
So I
and
mean,
they're teaching kids.
stop using internet is the only solution to stop sharing information.
You know,
It's just
elementary
not
school
feasible.
kids, they want them to be programmers, play with a computer, get everything, you'll spend your whole life in front of the computer.
Good
And
for me.
What do they know about any of this stuff?
That's where the jobs are gonna be.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we
Be
think.
smarter about it.
I'm gonna press on.
Yeah, please do.
Please do.
Yeah.
Just a little last question, may I?
Sure.
Can you a little bit explain how the public fundings work? Because if public funding by a government, but the internet is international, so should the public funding of a particular service only limited to its own citizens or what?
It depends. It's completely dependent on what the service is. So let me give an example here of transit information, which is definitely something that's appropriate for government funding in particular regions, because somebody in San Francisco doesn't really care when the bus is coming in Seattle. In the U.S., so there's lots of uses for IT in the public transportation realm. So just schedules and then real-time arrival information. When's the bus actually coming as opposed to when it's supposed to be. And a lot of this is offered via the surveillance capitalism companies, Google, Bing, etc., or startups like the Transit app, which has many millions of dollars in venture capital funding, and they're doing it presumably because they will then have something valuable, a company they can sell to one of these other venture capital or surveillance capitalist companies. So in some regions, these are the only ways you can get real-time information and trip planning. The transit agencies, we don't have any money. Google will do it for free. We'll just put a link to Google. That's what happens. In others, so like Sound Transit's policy as well, we'll have a website with trip planning stuff, but it's too much for us to support any apps. You got to get it from Google, etc. So I like open source privacy preserving alternatives. So One Bus Away is one that is got a pretty good share of the ridership in this region. How many of you use One Bus Away? How many of you use a different? How many of you use a different thing like the Transit app or Google or Bing or something like that?
You can text and get bus
Yeah,
away.
or you can text. So that's actually One Bus Away. Still.
Is One Bus Away working anymore? A week ago
Oh,
it
yeah.
wasn't.
I used it last week.
He funded it. Trying to use it, the message came back that.
Oh, well, let's see,
the
so-
county had agreed to pay for it. so-
Okay, hang on to that thought. We'll come back to that one. That was just the trip. That was the trip planner. This is something that's dear to my heart because two of my PhD students developed it in 2008 at UW, and I've been involved with the project ever since. I think this is a good example, though, of an alternative to surveillance capitalism in a particular domain, getting information about buses. By being open source, we can say, well, here's the code, you can look at it, you can see what information is being gathered. There's also attention to accessibility, so I've done a bunch of work on making sure this is useful for blind people, deafblind folks, low vision people, and so forth. We can try to respond to local needs, like we need some extra stuff when the viaduct is closing, stuff like that. We just recently set up a nonprofit, a 501c3 called the Open Transit Software Foundation is the home for it. Before it was under UW, but you know, it's moved beyond UW. I'm going to try this analogy here. It's like the public option, you know, for the Obamacare. So, you know, it won't say you have to use this. You can use Google or the transit app if you want. But I think it's useful to have something that is funded and supported by the transit agencies and that is good at preserving privacy and can be there for the long term. At least that's the argument I'm trying to give to them. I haven't actually persuaded the local ones of this. So Sound Transit in particular only has its website and otherwise says it's up to the market. Metro, unfortunately, rather than putting its money into One Bus Away, funded something called Trip Planner, which is, you know, a proprietary Metro app. How many use that? How many people use that? Oh, a couple. Okay. Okay. Anyway.
I couldn't figure out how to get the buses to the ferries and get the schedules to, so I need a trip planner.
Okay, okay. Anyway, I've been bugging Metro to, you know, contribute to One Bus Away and then have something that's open source as opposed to proprietary. This, the foundation has a board that includes a bunch of representatives from transit agencies, so the transit agencies have some control over it. Let's see, so to answer your question about what stopped working, so most of what One Bus Away does is the schedules and the real-time arrival information. On Android, there's also a trip planner built in, and Google suddenly decided to start charging for its geolocation data, where you type in an address and it says where it is, at $1,000 a month. And we actually set up the it was hard to get the transit agencies to do this, but finally the idea of, well, you're going to have to pay $1,000 a month motivated them to support the 501c3, but you know, lawyers move slowly, and Google, it wasn't set up in time, and we said, Google, can you just hold on? And they said, nope, we're charging you $1,000 a month. So I burned through all the UW budget, and then we shut it off. But now we're a 501c3 and it's back on. So that's what happened with that. I'd rather pull the plug on Google altogether on this, by the way, and use Pelios or some open source alternative for the geocoding.
So why do you use Google? Are they just better?
It was easy. It was easy. I wasn't in charge of that one either. So, yeah, you know, the thing, you know, they're very good.
But it shouldn't be too hard to change also, right? This is just an API that you use.
Well, yeah, and you need to contract with another company or run the servers yourself. But yeah, it's not, you know, it requires some programming, but it's not too bad. The trouble is, the apps are basically volunteer maintained at this point.
And the thing is, this can happen anywhere, anytime with all of these so-called free APIs. So Google Maps did the same thing a few years back, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It was all free, and then they shut it out. I know it's a victim, right?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a strong argument for transit agencies, saying, no, we want to have something we have some control over. It may not be the latest and flashiest thing, but you know, at least we know that we can maintain it because it's open source and keep providing it for our riders. Okay, so anyway, I like this as, you know, this is an example of you know, one kind of specialized domain.
So One Bus Away, what's the reach of it? Is it just the Seattle region, or is it?
No, we're about 10 now. So it is in One Bus Away. It's as such is in San Diego, Tampa, Spokane, Bedford, Oregon. There are branded versions in New York City, York, Canada, Poznan in Poland. There's a Polish version called PD Bus. There's a Spanish version for all the buses in Buenos Aires. Let's see, there might be another. Did I say New York City? Anyway, that's another one.
So it's open source and anybody can spin off.
Yeah.
And the transit agency provides the raw data, the real-time data
Yes.
of the buses.
Yes. And yeah, and they make it available to Google as well, and Bing and so forth. So in this region, the way that it works is there is a one bus away server that Sound Transit runs, and that actually aggregates data from King County Metro, ferries, intercity transit, community transit, Everett Transit, the streetcar, children's hospital shuttle, etc., and then parcels that out to the apps. And the apps also have this localization thing. So if you look at it, it'll say, you know, do you want to automatically select your region, and then you use the GPS and say, oh, if you're in Spokane, you can use, you know, Spokane's data.
And it collects no personal information then.
That's correct.
Would you consider?
Well, except you know, but except for the fact that the trip planner is using Google Maps for this geolocation thing.
Well, yeah. So that was. How much is going back to Google just from that? I mean, you're just pulling.
Where you are when you ask for a trip.
Okay,
yeah.
So it does know something about you.
Yeah.
And if the data gets overlaid on the map, that too, right? So your trip as well.
Well, that's true, because if it depends on which platform you're using. If you're using Android, then it is overlaying the data on Google Maps. Yes.
But when the app one bus away, such as that geolocation thing, it doesn't pass on other information that who this is for, right? So
That's correct. It
there's
just
a
says.
disconnect there, so it's not like it's telling me that this guy storing a cookie on my phone or something that it can tell that I have moved now, or it is basically one bus away, getting my location and then sending it to Google to geolocate and sending it back to one bus away.
Yes.
So Google does not directly know of where I
It can
am.
correlate a lot of information, right?
Yeah, yes,
Even if you're
absolutely.
using any other app that's got geolocation.
Would you consider?
Right.
Would One Bus Away consider non-tracking advertisements that is basically random? Let's say.
Right.
So they're not as targeted, but there'd be some income.
Yeah. We used to sort of get, you know, every week or 3 we'd get another query about selling ads, and we decided we didn't want to, which is kind of this purist position. It also means we have, you know, $46 in the bank account.
Yes. Can government get a hold of this information anytime it wants, or does it have to go through a judge or something like that?
So you mean sort of what the stuff that's held by Google, Facebook,
yes.
etc.?
Yes, if they're prosecuting somebody or.
I don't know. You know, certainly with a warrant they can ask for it. And you know, the Snowden revelations were that there was a lot of backdoors into this. But I don't know all of them.
I think the most interesting thing is we are talking about Google kind of data, but in the last case, I was like the Dallas cop that shot a person. Her text messages were available as evidence. So
Text is not secure at all.
yeah, it's not secure also, but if they have a subpoena, they can ask the telephone company, and this is a police officer, and still that data is available for the court. So I think that probably is not a kind of a problem, as in that's neither here nor there. Kind of that should be available probably if needed with due process. But I think the problem is without due process is available to certain entities, and I think that's kind of the troubling.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, and they know that you associated with somebody else, or if you traveled in a certain area, if that sort of information is available generally, or if it requires an actual subpoena.
That I don't know.
For government, yes, it does require an actual subpoena.
Yeah.
For companies that hold this information, obviously don't, but a lot of them make the promise this particular type of information is encrypted. So they know that there's a person, let's say we're all sitting here, all of our phones at this moment, all the smartphones are transmitting our location, whether you want to or not. It's just some are transmitting with the name. Like, so for example, my Google Maps actually tracks me because I use it for work. Otherwise, there are some people who opted out. The information is getting sent to Google, so Google knows that there are like 25 of us sitting in this room. They just don't know who exactly. There are 25 people sitting in the room at the library. And this is how it works.
And this is one of the good arguments just against centralization generally, is that once those data exist in one centralized location or a few centralized locations, you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, it's valuable, right? No one, even if, you know, the unforeseeable happens and Google goes bankrupt or something, no one's gonna wanna delete that, it's too valuable. And so as long as it exists, it's potentially on the table, for any future, dystopian power to access.
I'll
See,
say
my
what I said
problem
in
is not that
my
the-
talk last time, I think
Well-
I did right. Down the future, we are one incident, we are one 9/11 or whatever away from every single byte of information that is in these companies' hands being in the hands of the government. Cause you know what? They'll stand up and they'll fight it for a little bit, but I guarantee you Larry and Sergey and Zuck are not going to jail for anybody.
They'll take an act of Congress, they can't.
And that's
just-
exactly right.
Yeah.
One 9/11, and there will be an act of Congress.
Well, that's what the
You meant the other way, but he,
No, no.
yeah,
No, I think it-
yeah.
yeah.
That's right. But my problem is not that Google knows something about me. My problem is that I don't know what Google knows about me.
Yeah.
The lack of transparency. If there was a way for me to request, like, hey guys, I want to know what you know. Like, what does it look like? What does my digital footprint looks like? What do I like? What I dislike? What are you selling me?
Well-
Is there something? Do I have some pathology that I should look into? Do you know?
Yeah.
Any help? I don't know. It's like one of those things where you try to request that information, just like what they did with Cambridge Analytica. They tried to request. Forgot the name of the guy, but he, actually subpoenaed the court records. They deleted and destroyed everything, and somebody went to jail for 30 days just because they did not want to disclose what they actually have on you.
Yeah. So Zuboff has an interesting history of a privacy activist who was suing Facebook to know exactly what Facebook knew about him, and it was just incredibly hard to dig it out.
Now, some information is available, but just about you. I assume what you're talking about is the correlated information you don't know about.
Exactly.
'Cause
Yeah.
But
you can,
fine, yeah.
But I mean, if let's say an FBI has a file on me, I can file under Freedom of Information Act or the Immigration
Yeah.
Services or anything else. I can actually get the government to turn over whatever the hell they have on me. I cannot get these big corporations to turn over because they have privacy shields on top of privacy shields on top of the agreements, the user agreements that you agree to. And so you're like, oh my god, it's my data. Can I have access to it, please?
So I got 2 more slides, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna just finish up. So I was talking about one bus away and specialized domains. So let's look at the elephant briefly for what could we do about Facebook and social media? So I don't know is the answer. But here's some ideas for pieces of a solution. So I think breaking things up is one step, but it's not enough. If we've got 10 surveillance capitalism firms instead of one, then they're just 9 more to keep track of. So I think another important thing would be to require true data portability. So I say, no, I want to get off of this thing. The original has to delete it. We'd have to include audits to make sure they deleted it, go somewhere else. I think if there could be open APIs that would allow other kinds of social media companies, nonprofits, cooperatives, voluntary associations, etc., to come into the picture. And then for one, assuming we still had advertising supported things, at least more transparency about how the ads are placed and where they come from and who's paying for them. So this is not the whole solution at all, but I'm throwing this out partly to say, well, I don't think we should just say it's hopeless. Facebook won.
yesterday, a new social network was announced here in Seattle, and I'm blanking on the name, that claims they will not accumulate any data. And
okay.
they just got a few $1 million of funding, so they're not
Okay.
live yet. So
Okay.
that's one, and I know of
There's
another
also
that.
Mastodon.
What?
Yeah. Mastodon, which exists already.
Okay, this is a different. I don't
This
know
is
this
another
one.
social media.
Yeah. And then I'm working on one with, as well, and I think we've made the decision not to collect any user data.
How are you paying for it?
We're still talking about that, but we have there's a kind of a side business on that, where we'll be charging for storage.
Okay.
And making money that way. And we may do non-targeted advertising. In fact, Brave has a non-targeted advertising system, but it's, I think, too complicated because it uses blockchains to pay you for watching ads and
right.
stuff. No one wants to do that.
Yeah.
But,
Okay.
So I think there are absolutely ways to make it go, whether it's $5 a month or you pay by how much you store, and that's that. I think there are ways to do this from a capitalist point of view that, but I also like the idea of national public Facebook. That's
Okay, so last slide. So here's the book, which I recommend. If you go to Democracy Now! And search for Zuboff, you can find that interview that I showed in a second one. Here's the paper that I'm basing this on, or send me a note, and I'm happy to point you at things. Okay, there, we went through all the slides.
I think the previous slide that you have the open API thing, I think that's kind of the solution, right? Where you are actually doing a public funded APIs for doing those kind of things, right? That's where the public funding, I think it would be a bad idea if there would be a public sector application, but
that seems problematic.
yeah, I think the government would have too much information at that point, or maybe potentially. So I think it's kind of when they have open APIs like these or support these things, develop these open API, then people can use them, and anybody who's not doing it for profit should not need to pay for it, and maybe the big corporations need to pay for it, so the government offsets their cost or something. And so I think those kind of initiatives I think would be good on the public to promote on the public front, where governments can open their data with APIs, and like that geolocation data, I'm pretty sure like some government agency has similar data.
I mean, I think there's also a kind of a quid pro quo business that can be used here. So Google, take public transit again, is getting all the data from Metro, et cetera, about where all the buses are and the schedules. But they could be required to give something back for that.
Can you talk a bit about other forms of surveillance that people may not be aware of? For instance, your smart TVs are monitoring everything at this point. My understanding is they are even watching the fingerprinting your shows. So even if you're doing your own home videos, it knows what you're watching.
Oh, really?
Do you know anything about this?
No.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. They'll look at the pixels on the screen, sample them every now and then, compress it, and sending it back home. It's a known business model. The CTO, I think it was, of Vizio, came out and acknowledged this. If you want a dumb TV, first of all, you can't buy them. If you want one, it would cost a couple $100 more.
Keep it off the, don't plug it in.
Don't ever plug a smart TV and connect it to the internet, for God's sake.
So if you don't connect to the internet or connect to your Wi-Fi, right, not just Ethernet but Wi-Fi also, then that information will go nowhere, right? So basically the moral of the story is don't plug those TVs that have these services available directly to the internet. But I think things like Apple TV might also track you in other ways, but at least it's
much better.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Point of smart TV, so you can actually have the smart TV capability, which you can't have with the internet. The whole idea is that you can go to Netflix, onto Amazon Prime, and everything else was just a click of a button. You don't need a third party. You don't need your phone.
Right, but you pay for that convenience.
That is correct, yes. But you cannot, I mean, what I'm saying is that you cannot get a smart TV and get it to work without connecting to the internet. Therefore, as soon as you get it, you're going to be submitting your information. So it's just, if you're buying a smart TV, you just know that you're going to be sending some of your stuff out.
You can use a media center of your own creation. You can, it's all kinds of other things. An Apple TV, for example.
And I think nobody really gets a smart, I think there might be a sector of people who want a smart TV for those applications, but I think generally it's not an option anymore to get a non-smart TV, at least I've not seen one. So they are all quote unquote smart, but do you need them? I think if you just use it for a TV and then have these other devices connected for other uses, then you don't really need because I think the other danger that I think people might be aware by now, but I'm just throwing it out, there are hacks which turn on that camera of your built-in camera in your TV and transmit your
Yeah, take the camera over and that's a given, yeah.
Or mic.
How about another one, license plate scanners, which the government uses, so it's a government thing, but then they sell the data, right? It's in some places.
So,
red light cameras.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. Seattle, we're a leader in municipal legislation. It's happening right now. God, everybody should pay attention to this. Go, I don't have the website handy. Right now, there's pushback. Seattle it's got like a 4-part ordinance that they're putting together to try to manage this data that's being gathered by our government. We don't have anything to regulate the corporations yet, but ALPR data is one of them, license plate data, which is tracking around, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on.
And California has passed a law about data aggregation. I don't know the details, but the big tech companies are fighting to put a national law in place to override it that is much less powerful.
Right.
So when someone says, oh, we've got a national law coming, watch out, it might not be as good as your local laws.
Right, because they're going to override, they're gonna say, this is national law, you may
Right.
not have any enactment that
Which is what-
locally, which is.
Right, Trump's trying to do with into California and the environment.
I wonder if those of you who are involved in enterprises that are developing social media especially could comment on the possibilities of distributed systems, meaning from the technological point of view, social networks that do not involve a central server or server.
That's what I'm working on.
And that's a Mastodon thing also.
Is that
Mastodon.
does
Yeah,
that?
it's.
Yeah.
Do you believe that it's scalable? And is
Yes.
it just that we took a fork in the road towards, internet as TV, and that it's just a technological choice, or is there a difficult problem with not having centralized services?
Anything distributed is harder, but absolutely doable. Yeah, I mean,
I think it's, my opinion is inevitable eventually. We all used central computers that we just all had terminals. I mean, eventually we wanted the power ourselves. We have personal computers, personal things, and now we've kind of backtracked a bit. Absolutely federated, not just distributed system, federated is a little bit easier to.
There's something similar to that with the ham radio world. It's called HamWAN, HAMWAN.org. I don't know exactly how it works, all that, but in a sense, like if the internet goes down, parts of this region can still have their own internet and connect that way using the HamWAN. So that sounds similar to what you're talking about.
I'm just not really seeing the case for behavioral manipulation other than to ultra-target advertising or to promote conspiracy theories. People don't have critical thinking skills. And that is a lot of the population, granted, but.
I'll talk about something.
Virtually all.
so essentially you're saying, what's so bad about accumulating this data? It's just
Yeah,
being
really,
used
like,
for...
so they know that what size jeans I wear, and then I like dark coffee and I have cats.
Yeah,
Okay.
so what?
So what you
How
don't
is
know
that-
is how that gets, that may mean through the ML, deep ML.
Machine learning.
Machine learning,
Yeah.
yeah. Those 3 data points might very well say that you are likely to be get a certain form of cancer at a certain age. You have no clue. You cannot know what those algorithms are deriving out of that data, but they will.
And
But
they'll
they're-
do well
You'll
with
never
it.
know. And you may, so eventually, this is already being used for insurance purposes.
Well,
It will
that's
be used-
illegal.
It will be used for jobs, it will be used for which schools your kids get into, all across the board. People don't think about it.
Obama convinced gays and immigrants to come out of the closet.
Absolutely.
And then Trump came into office and said, we know where you are. You never know who's gonna change what in the future, and they all have all information on you, and suddenly there's no backing out of it. Several years ago, I heard someone at Microsoft saying that they were working on not only facial recognition, but motion to see how you're moving. Yeah, do you look like you might be in the process of committing a crime?
It's called Kinect, yes. They use that.
Or something like that. I'm just saying, we don't know what they'll be coming up with in the future.
Well, then why are we assuming it's gonna be horrible and dangerous and scary?
We
Yeah,
don't
because
wanna-
they use that kind of data to design robots that can help people with spinal injuries learn to walk.
Right.
So it has a good side as well.
So there's certainly benefits to all this, and I guess I am worried about what has been happening so far, in terms of undermining the democratic process in particular. And then in terms of behavioral manipulation, I mean, one is just, making, Facebook, et cetera, more and more addictive. If you look at teenagers, they just live an incredible amount of their lives on this thing, and it
It's going down.
doesn't seem healthy.
Teenagers are actually on the decrease, the 20s and up sort.
Okay.
Right, but they're using something else.
Danger of them collecting this
Facebook's just a
information is
name
that
placeholder.
they, ideally, not only they can manipulate what kind of I don't know, cat food you get, but they also can manipulate the bigger problems that, let's say they know that you are, that two parties, party A, party B. Let's say you are in party A, and so they'll start sending you more stuff that is inflammatory to what you would be as a party A. And then me is going to be getting the opposite videos, and so now there's clashing of the, technically they're manipulating how regular people perceive things, and that's the danger. That when they know that when they start using it, but we do have laws against it. It's called wire fraud, and we should start enforcing them.
It's a positive feedback loop. So the extreme get more, or the non-extreme start getting more and more extreme, and extreme get more extreme in either direction. So it's so one concern that I think is legitimate is that it drives extremism in whatever direction you were going to go.
Yeah.
Otherwise without nerd. So that's one concern. There can be laws, there are laws against using it for insurance, and there should be more. The same thing with jobs. So we can identify them piece by piece.
Aren't there car insurance companies that will give you cheaper insurance if you're willing to be completely monitored?
It's happening now, and it's worse than that. The proxy is.
But that's not completely monitored, that's monitored your car usage. It's not,
that's true.
So
different.
the insurance companies are restricted from using, for example, race, but guess what? They've got Spotify data, and they use, you like rap music, that's a proxy for race. And this is the shit that's going on right now that people aren't thinking about.
And all this is in the context of a free society like ours.
Yeah.
But again, someplace like China or some other autocratic could use this for far more sinister to totally control the population.
So I think there are two interesting things that the Elon Musk, famous Elon Musk interview. He said some really good things in there, but the only thing you hear about is him smoking and joint. But he has some point about AI and how AI could be destructively used and stuff like that. So I highly recommend that. And then I think this is not even new. There's a very old TED talk about the search bubbles. And that is telling you how same people searching for the same terms would get different results based on their history. And so this is an example of that manipulation in your, if you have a tendency towards a party or extreme ideology, it would just serve you that kind of material versus another person searching for the exact same thing. I think that the example, if I remember correctly, was Hillary, and the same people searched for Hillary, and the people who were Republican leaning got some really disparaging stuff, and people who searched Hillary and they knew they were Democratic leaning got some really fabulous stuff. So basically, and this is just an example, right? This is happening, and this is Google doing it, and so just kind of be aware that this is already happening. And it can go extreme, and then Elon Musk thing about AI.
Yeah, but the technology is developing, so obviously we need to monitor it, we need to keep an eye on it to make sure that this, unethical stuff doesn't really happen. But think back in the day, I don't remember the year, but 30 years ago, there was a store that was caught that was mailing out the, what are they called, coupons? Or not the coupons, but the flyers, sorry. It was their weekly specials based on the zip code. People from different zip code would get flyers with different pricing. They were living next to each other, practically, but where the zip code cuts off, they get a whole different pricing, and people from wealthier, wider neighborhoods were getting prices that were higher. And so at some point we passed a law that prohibits that kind of discrimination, so now everybody gets the same flyer, basically.
Amazon was playing with that a while back too.
Yeah. But I think the interesting problem here is, unfortunately, our politicians do not understand this realm, right? They understand the coupons, they understand the flyers, they do not understand internet. And you can see how they, Fluffy Duff Zuckerberg in his interview, oh my God, this is a love fest. And they didn't ask any good questions because they probably, okay, so either it's, there's a famous quote about, if you can think it's incompetence, then don't think it's malfeasance, but I don't know that quote. But if you can attribute it to blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but I think it is either incompetence or worse, it's these guys that are in the cahoots. And somebody said most of those people in that committee hearing had received funding from Zuckerberg or Facebook or one of their PACs or whatever. So research that also, right? So if somebody's going to fund your next re-election, do you really want to ask him really hard questions? Where he might not get pissed off and.
Maybe I'll mention another case of that, which is criticism of this business model within the computer science academic community. So I'm retired, but I'm retired from the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. Across the street from me is the Bill Gates building with the Amazon Auditorium, the Zillow Commons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the, and, you know, and I've gotten money from Google, but it's more than that. 3 of my PhD students have gone to work for Google. You know, so my friends work at Google Research. You know, there's a whole social network of, you know, that doesn't make it very comfortable to be criticizing this.
Well, really, is the feeling that it's okay, or are there people like you
No,
grumbling
we just sort
about
of,
it?
let's talk about some technical things. I did actually have a reading group with, you know, this is a 660-page book, and I wanted to have some company reading it, so I thought I'd get a couple of graduate students, but there are 14 of them that signed up. So there's a bunch of interest.
Sounds like a good first order sort of thing for society to figure out is whether or not it suffices to think of all the bad things that can happen with this data collection, make laws against those things and enforce them, or whether having information concentrated that enables those things is in and of itself the problem. And until we have some consensus on that, it feels like maybe we're just going to be talking.
Well, I don't know if it's either or. I think both of those need some control.
Well, the second one kind of encompasses the first, because if you don't have the information, you can't do the bad things to begin with.
But there's certain kinds of information that probably they shouldn't have, but they will have a bunch of it.
It's the centralization and the aggregation of enough of it that causes the problem. And I've been working on getting that message out for many years. The second part of what you're doing, it's just not okay. There's no way to manage it. In the history of our planet, whenever there's been mass information about individuals, those people with the information will always misuse it at the end of the day, at some point, in some way. It's hard to get around.
Have we seen examples of that yet outside of, say, Cambridge Analytica, which I maintain is just very effective advertising used for purposes we don't happen to like? Have we seen actual examples of, in this country or Europe, and let's exclude China because China is its own thing, have we seen that bad stuff happen, or is this still theoretical?
You think 2016 was
Myanmar,
Philippines?
Philippines? But this country? No, I think 2016.
What about right-wing extremists and violence?
Okay. So you're maintaining that that's driven by...
Certainly partly by you know, YouTube's recommendation algorithms.
So they know enough about you. But is that really data aggregation, or are they just watching what you click on? Do they need anything more than your search history?
But see, you know, if I'm let's say a Trump supporter, no amount of YouTube algorithms in the world are going to make me watch Bernie Sanders or, you know,
No, but it does. If the evidence is good, then it does drive you more extreme.
No, but I want to address this. This is a really important point.
Yeah.
You don't need to take a Trump supporter and turn them into a Bernie supporter or vice versa.
Right.
In aggregate, all you need to do is move, you don't move one person 100%. You move 100 million people 1/4%. It's the same thing as raising the ocean by 1 inch. You don't need to do much to completely throw things off socially.
Okay.
Right?
But again, is that...
Are we worried that these companies are going to start this, you know, Civil War #2? Or is
not
that
themselves. They created the engine that other people can use. They can't stop it.
But what if has anything happened yet? So we have one thing that YouTube is driving some extremism and very targeted advertising that may have affected an election both here and in Brexit land. What else?
I think Trump is driving the news cycle with his Twitter account.
But that's not data
Well,
acquisition, that's something else
has
entirely.
nothing to do with my data, that's just awesome.
Well, let's say
So
the,
it's-
the
we have a
shooter in the
fear.
mosque in New Zealand, who, set this up to be live streamed.
But that's not data acquisition, aggregation.
true.
That's data distribution, that's broadcasting, that's a whole different topic.
We've had broadcasting for decades. Since
Yeah.
and
So
we
I think,
that
I think
advertisers are not
there's
the
this
We
fear
have
that
CIA
something
now,
bad.
we have Facebook, I mean, it's just, it's kind of moved from one and.
Yeah, so we have some concern that something could happen. We haven't seen it yet.
Actually, the immigrants, the whole thing with the illegal immigrants, people know who, there's enough aggregated data that you know who you're connecting with and whatnot. And you people there must be something there, and especially if they came out after Obama. They know who you're connecting with.
Okay, that's a good one. So that's government misusage of data, but not
Does that
private
happen,
misuse.
or is that just theoretical?
No, that's I think
ICE is
happening.
using social media.
I think that's a very good example.
New York Times record.
So what about things like the do not fly list? One, you don't know how you get on it, and you don't know who's on it, and is that data aggregation?
We don't know, but again, okay, that's the government using it, yeah. So we are concerned about government misuse.
Big corporations cannot put you in jail, government can. So, I mean, government can take away your freedoms. So that's why we want government to be controlled, and that's why we have democracy in elections and so forth and so on, but.
There's no difference because government will have at some point access to all this. There's no way around it. It may not be this year, next year, maybe 10 years from now. One event is all it's gonna take, for sure. Congress will act. So it can't sit there and be aggregated for your whole lifetime because you can't undo it and your kids will be in there, everything.
Then I choose to worry about it when it's about to happen
It's
because
way too late.
That's because I think that here's the thing, right? If
you can't do anything about it, that's the thing.
No, but I think if we start educating ourselves, then our representatives, and make them understand what is happening really, like not just superficially by Cambridge Analytica kind of things, but like understand how this could be dangerous for the fabric of society, democracy and other things. We need to educate ourselves and then our representatives so they can start making laws now. And I think that was Elon Musk's point about artificial intelligence, that with these kind of,
I know IT developers who have been working in the industry for 10 years who don't understand half of the stuff that the big companies are doing. How do you expect our representatives who are not professionals of the industry to understand it?
But they only need to understand the economic interests. That's Zuboff.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that the problem is they need to pay attention to this and stop this before it becomes unstoppable, which some people think is too late already.
6 years
But-
ago?
Well, his point is education. You're right. Educate everybody. Our society, our children, need to be educated.
Yeah, probably children are better in
They're
this.
going to be smarter about it than our generation. For sure.
I agree, yeah. I think that probably children are better investment in that regard, right? Because they would become the future. And if you train them now, at least like tell them what, this is not free, right? Because a lot of kids still think, or I think a lot of people still think, but kids for sure, that, oh, this is all free and great. And then what is the price of it? They should know what they are sacrificing and how it could affect their future.
Just like climate change.
Yes, exactly. It's like environment from, I feel like I'm the environmentalist from 1970s. You know, if you were in the 1970s, those of us that were, if you went, oh, pollution's bad, people would yell at you and call you an idiot. It took, it's taken a generation, and it will take at least a generation because this is a far more complex subject. We can look around and kind of understand pollution, but this is far more.
It's also more
insidious
It's hidden,
more
yeah,
complicated.
it's non-transparent.
I think the interesting thing is the kids are growing up with this technology, so I think they are much smarter. If we train them, they can actually kind of grow into being super smart about these things if they know from the start, right? Because
they get more exposure, they get what's more
exposure doesn't
looking
mean
for.
knowledge.
They dumb down to it. They don't see it. They don't really they don't really care.
Are you talking
I have
about
a
people who
daughter
have
in
a
college.
selfie of me every place? Oh, I'm somewhere in Europe right now, so there's nobody at my home. Of course, there are cameras all over, but, like the guy in Edmonds who stole the police camera. And so they got a picture of him stealing the camera.
it's my understanding in England that all the surveillance there, and they're the most monitored country, has not reduced crime, but has increased convictions, capturing convictions of them. Maybe that's good. Well, maybe we should come to an official end here, and thank you, and then we can stick around for individual questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.